Hi everybody. In this VR render video, we're going to take a look at the creation of this scene right here using Twinmotion 2024.2. We'll go through all the steps from getting your model from SketchUp into Twinmotion using the datasmith. And we'll talk about how to establish the ground plane, how to add vegetation, foliage, how to set up your camera and set up the lighting to give a fall or autumnal style shot. I'll also do the post-production at the very end and go through how to basically work on this in Photoshop. This tutorial is primarily designed for people who are new to Twinmotion or somebody who just wants a fully narrated tutorial from start to finish. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get going. So this is the home that we're going to use. I'm using basically just a pre-made home from the warehouse just to speed things up a little bit. This is by Eddie Morrow, Quad Home Modular Houses, and I have gone ahead and downloaded it into SketchUp. So let's go over to SketchUp and turn this off. And there we go. Let me take a look at the home right here. You can see I've changed a few little things. I did remove the watermark, mostly just because it was actually kind of conspicuously sitting right here. But again, this is Eddie Morrow, really nice home from the SketchUp warehouse. And I've deleted one or two pieces of furniture out in the inside, but for the most part, this will work for what we have intended. Now, just checking our scale, make sure everything is good in comparison to our scale model. And once we're happy with that, we can go ahead and delete the scale model. Now, in order to get this over to Twinmotion, I am going to use the datasmith exporter. You can get this from the Twinmotion Twinmotion sort of website. You'll have to download it and install it. It runs as its own installer package. So once you download and run it with admin rights, it will install directly into SketchUp. All you have to do is click the export to datasmith file, and then anytime you make changes, you can just hit the sync button. You can also turn on the auto sync, which automatically should send changes over to Twinmotion, but I have had sort of mixed results with that, and I prefer just to do it manually. So anytime we make a change, for example, I have added this concrete slab to the base of our home. All you have to do is just hit sync over here. All right, and we're going to bounce directly into Twinmotion now. So you can see here is our brand new, this is Twinmotion 2024.1.2, but if you're using a newer version or, or you're watching this maybe a few months after the video was made, you might be using a newer version of Twinmotion. Please note that most of what we'll talk about will probably stay the same. So just keep that in mind. We'll be using a mixture of path tracing and Lumen. We're going to do a few interior shots on this as well, but this is primarily a tutorial on exterior rendering in Twinmotion. All right, in order to get our scene, our build into Twinmotion, we're just going to click import. Going to go ahead and just click this, click here to import file. You can see I've got a SketchUp link here, and I am going to do collapse by material. My understanding here is that this will tell Twinmotion to make sure that any materials that are shared from our SketchUp model will actually be identified as a single object. All right, everything else should be fine. Click import, looks pretty nice. I'm just going to hit 3 on my keyboard just to slow down the camera. But all in all, everything looks good. First thing I generally recommend doing, though, or at least for my students, is go to the metal tab, grab the brass material, and I'm just going to pop into the house in here. And I like to just drag this over all of the different parts, just to make sure that, for example, when I assign a material to the cabinets here, that it is only being assigned to the cabinets. And you can see here, 2 different wood materials. That looks nice. I'm not really seeing any major red flags here. For example, this brass material is not being assigned to the interior walls when I drag it onto the exterior glass. And so I think that's all in all pretty happy with that. All right, you can see we've got our materials all done and we're ready to start building the environment. First thing we want to do is place a background in there. So I'm going to go back to SketchUp and I'm going to just search in the 3D warehouse. I'm going to do BACKGROUND, background. And we're going to use some by Max Sikovsky. I've used and referenced him before in the past. And you can see we've got a beautiful one right here. Now I'm looking for this one. This has got mountains. So this is background number 19, Max Sikovsky. Again, I'm going to download that, load it directly into your SketchUp scene, and just place it. Now, once we have it in, I am going to just right click and I'm going to use the component to group extension from Eneroth. I can link out to that on basically afterwards, but this will just convert this component directly into group, and I'm going to resync again and take a look here. All right, lovely stuff. That looks nice. That's sufficiently far away. I think we could probably move these closer if needs be, but for now, I think visually they look good. Next thing we need to do is adjust the landscape, because you actually notice, like, realistically, sort of homes like this that are kind of in remote areas, you don't have a flat. It's not like it's subdivided or subdivision development where the ground has, for the most part, been intentionally leveled, especially if you're familiar with sort of the American suburb look. So here we're going for something a little bit more remote, a little bit where the landscape is more hilly and undulating. And so let's bop over to the Twinmotion landscape tools. I'm going to sculpt the landscape a little bit, and that will give us a great starting point. Okay, to get our landscape going, we are going to go to Library. I'm going to go to Vegetation and Landscapes. I'm going to use the rocky grassland. Just drag this directly into my scene. It'll say Preparing Terrain. And you'll kind of notice a little bit of change going on here. But the ground plane is still there, and that's fine. We can work around that. But what we'll actually end up doing is sculpting on this area underneath, okay? So what we can do is select the starting ground, hide it. We're going to add materials to the starting ground later, but for now, this will give us a good, kind of baseline. Okay, and then what we're going to do is scroll down on the top right where it says Scene and click on Rocky Grassland. What we'll actually do is just start sculpting this. Now, I kind of have an idea of how this should look in my head, but there's a lot of things to note here. If you had more better topographical data, you might try and match that. If you've gone out to the site and actually looked at what's around, you might try and do that. I had to do that kind of recently for a family home that's going to be out in a sort of remote area. It was kind of cool to be able to do that. Now, the sculpting tools are kind of, you can see on the right, pretty simplistic and very kind of familiar if you've used other landscape sculpting tools in Lumen or the new ones in DeFi. We've got things like raise, dig, or lower. We can smooth things up, we can basically undulate or add noise, and then we can also erode or flatten the tops. Now, they are going to be governed by the brush. Generally speaking, yeah, if you want, you can just keep the circle, it's fine. I haven't really noticed a huge difference. These are effectively just alphas that determine the fall off of the brush. And then we've got the diameter and intensity. So generally, what I recommend doing is making the brush pretty large, and then sort of dropping the intensity. Now, I know the shot is going to be something like this, kind of looking over this direction, but I'm going to just start slowly, and we'll see what happens. All right, so there we go. We finished sculpting our landscape, and if I quit media mode here, you can see we've added our water. Now, the way to add water, a simple way you can do this, is basically just go to Library, and then we're going to go to Objects, and we'll use Primitives. And you can see we've got these big old planes here, and these guys are come in various sizes. I mean, you can get really, really large ones here. And we've also got some other default shapes, but for the most part, I've just used the plane. And I've plopped this in here, and I have then assigned a water material. Although you'll notice if we turn on the path tracer, you can get kind of mixed results with this. Sometimes the path tracer will look good, and sometimes I've had it where it just appears like kind of basically black. So just buyer beware with that. There's a couple of issues. If this water doesn't look good, or we just can't get it looking nice, another trick you can also use is to change the water material to a glass material. And then maybe, I'll show you here really quickly, go Library, and then we can go Materials, and we can go Glass. And the ones I've had my students use is this Contaro pattern glass. And you can just drag it out here. If I turn on the path tracer, you can see we get nice reflections like that. Now, my path tracer is set to pretty low, so it looks a bit, terrible. But it also allows you to go in here and color the glass. And we can actually, for example, just adjust the UV scale if we're finding that the ripples are either too large or too small. And by ripples, what we're actually talking about is the normal map that is tied to this Contaro glass, which gives you a very nice kind of noise effect. But if you adjust the normal map scale, you can get kind of nice waves. Now, it's not perfect. It's a little bit too mathematically smooth. But for the most part, I've just applied this water material, and I'm pretty happy with it. So the next thing for us to do is to plant some trees. So you can see we've got our current scene set up, and I cleaned up the background a little bit more, just kind of remove some of the unnecessary sort of Twinmotion terrain. And this is the shot that we're going to start with, and we'll do a couple more after that. But what I have in my head is a tract of trees on the back right here, and then some trees closer to the water in kind of the near ground, foreground area, if you will. And then we've got pretty much kind of an empty-ish field is what I'm going for kind of over here on the left. So I'm going to quit the media mode and let's talk about placing trees. To do that, we're going to go to the populate tab. I'm going to turn off the media mode and I'm going to move myself over here to the left. Now you'll see when we go to populate, we've got a couple of different options. So the first one is going to be paint. I'm just going to grab this Japanese tree here. All right. And I'm just going to left click on the landscape. Now, you can see I can increase the brush diameter, and this just kind of allows me to scatter these over the landscape. I can also hit erase to get rid of those. That's pretty straightforward. And painting is a really cool and organic way to go about doing this. All right, I'm going to just ixnay out of this. We'll get away from that. I'm going to go back to populate as well. Let me close out my little tab here. Boop. And then we've also got options for scatter. So I'm going to drag out a bunch of different trees here. And what we'll do is, once we have these selected, hold on, Control to select multiples, I'm going to hit the Scatter tool and left click. And you can see it is just going to apply all of those all over the landscape. Now, one issue with the Scatter tool, like for trees like this, is I want more control. And you can see here, I do have options if I click on each actual tree for going in and removing or erasing as a whole. You can see I can left click on them. But for the most part though, scattering kind of works really nicely on a smaller scale. For me, I think this is obviously way too much. And the excess geometry, just gazillions of trees all over the place. It's just too much. So I'm gonna right click here and just delete this. I'm gonna do the same again on the painted vegetation and just delete. Now, we also have a couple of newer ways which are really, really cool. We can add spacing. So, for example, I'm going to left-click here, and you can see I've got a little yellow dot, and I'm going to right-click over here as well. I'm sorry, left-click again. And then just right-click to deselect. Now, I'm going to grab this cherry tree, and I'm going to grab this, let's do the plum tree, just for a bit of visual contrast. And you can see here, I've got some options now. Path tension, so if the path was curved, this would allow you to smooth or straighten out the curve a little bit. Random lateral offset is exactly what it sounds like, lateral sort of left to right, so it's just going to be coming offset off the line. And we can also adjust the count, which is really, really nice. And I'm going to add in a third tree, a third really obvious one, this crepe myrtle right here. And you can see here we can also click the button to randomize the order, and at any point we can always update the actual scattering as well, just to see kind of what Twinmotion comes to mind. Now, I'm not familiar with the concept of seed here, or how this is going to affect things, so it's probably in the documentation, I just haven't read it. But either way, this is a really fantastic way to establish your trees and greenery. Very similar to the line tool in Lumen and some of the path tools in D5. Now, we can also, I'm going to delete that. And again, we've got one last thing I do want to mention is the area tool. And so this is going to work in a similar fashion. Really just, again, left clicking to add. This kind of reminds me of just sort of vector paths within Illustrator. And now we've closed out the path. We've got really an area that we can drag our trees into. And again, we can use the scattering to kind of update just kind of the arrangement of objects. So if I put a different tree in here, and you can see we can just keep randomizing this to our heart's content, which is really nice. We can also, again, do the path tension. You can see how strictly we follow the actual path. And then the actual spacing and randomized spacing. Probability, I'm not really familiar with the concept of how this is going to pertain to this, but all in all, some really beautiful tools for randomizing your scene. But I want to do this really by hand. So again, I'm just going to right click and just delete. To get the shot set up the way I want, I'm going to go back to my stored camera, and I just need to keep this in mind. I'm going to quit the media mode, but this is the area to the right where I want a line of trees. Okay, what I'm going to do is start placing a very thematic bunch of trees. You want to make sure that you're using trees that sort of like make logical sense. Okay, we're ready to move on. A little close to the water, you'll actually notice that we've painted in some different textures. So you can do this with the default materials within Twinmotion. Now, you, to the best of my knowledge, cannot paint with Megascans materials, but you can paint with the default materials. And so under library materials, ground and nature, it's really easy. All you have to do is effectively just pick what you want to paint with. So for example, cobblestone. I'm just going to left click and let me redo this. So I'm just going to click on the cobblestone and I'm going to drag it into the slot I actually want. And now with the paintbrush selected, I can just simply go in here and paint the landscape that I want. Now you are somewhat limited to kind of the default materials, which is a bit of a shame. And there's no real sense of alpha blending, so you can't necessarily kind of merge textures perfectly. Now you can always go in here and change the brush to one of the other brushes. I'll move myself out of the way there. So for example, blobs or stains or whatever, but like, you know, they're not perfect and they're not necessarily going to work the way you think. Once you start brushing in, you can kind of see it looks, you know, a little bit better, but it's not perfect. So let's take a look at what we've done over here and we'll go through and blend these a little bit too. So, by the way, you will notice that if you change one, it does change all of them. And so you are effectively limited to the four, I don't know why I held up 5 fingers there, the 4 different paint materials that you can work with at any given time. But you can kind of smush them together a little bit, even though, again, truly, you don't have the ability to stack or necessarily adjust the layers like that. But all in all, we can do a nice mixture of, for example, dirt. I'm going to make sure my brush size is pretty low. And we're just going to start brushing this in. Just close to the riverbed, probably where the river kind of floods just a little bit. We're just going to start brushing that in. And then we can kind of transition that a little bit away. I want some actual wet sand, so I'm going to place that into this second slot here. And you can see this is where I already had some pre-made. It's already just covered that. And I think that looks pretty nice. And lastly, we're going to blend between 2 different grasses here. We've got this kind of what do you call this? Kind of a bit more Spartan grass, where there's a bit more kind of mud visible. And then we've actually picked this grass, which is grass 5, to be the default. All right, so that looks all in all pretty good. Like I said, yeah, there are limits to this, but you can get some nice smudges. And how much of this will truly be visible at the very end, that's kind of debatable, to be honest. But there we go, nice and kind of brushed in a little bit. Now, I do want to fix up this area over here. And I'm just going to make sure as well that my texture scale is even. Each of these 4 textures can technically have different texture scales, but obviously to make it look better, you want to make sure they are consistent. All right, with that being done, it's time to start messing around with the grass. And you can see I've already sprinkled a little bit of grass in here. And we're going to paint the grass on. So to do that, I'm going to move myself back to the right over here. And I'm going to go populate and place and paint. I'm not using scatter, and I'm not actually sure if the new spacing or area tools work, or if they don't really work well on undulating landscapes. So it might be a bit easier just to paint the stuff in. So what we'll do is we'll go to vegetation. We'll go to, we won't do detailed grasses. We'll do regular grass here. Move myself out of the way. And because this is taking on more of an autumnal or fall theme, and I'm moving away from kind of the piney woods feel and going for more sort of a northeast New England kind of feel, I think we'll stick with some dry grasses as well. It's funny how my original idea of this has changed quite a bit, but all right, let's keep going. We'll do this long grass. Let's do this dry wild grass one. We'll do some of the long grass, and we will have control over all of these as we brush them in. I'm going to throw in a few of these tall grasses, just a little dash. Okay, once I have that done, I'm going to make my brush size just a little bit bigger. I don't want it to be so big that we lose control. And we have to be mindful here. We do have the slab, so I'll have to be very careful to not brush in around that. And so I'm going to put my brush or my camera speed to about 3 and just make my diameter a little bit bigger. And if we have our stored camera, we can always click on that just to give ourselves an idea of what we will actually what we'll see and what we actually won't see. And we'll adjust this manually as well. Okay, start painting in. Okay, I'm going to pause the video and we'll be right back. Okay, you can see with our painting done, how the scene is starting to look. I'm going to turn off the path tracer. Do recommend, though, checking your work with the path tracer or just turning Lumen on to give you a more real-time feel. But you can see we've also got a bit of an issue here where the grass just kind of stops. And my hope here is that really it's not that visible in the final shot. Now, again, there's a chance I'll have to go back and mess around with it. All in all, pretty happy with the overall trajectory of the project. I'm going to add a few more sprigs and sort of plants and greenery that you'd get close to the water line. And I'm still pretty happy with the overall look of things. So to add a few more plants to the waterline, we're actually going to go back to library, mega scans, and we're going to do 3D plans. Now, I'll probably need to add a few rocks and stones and things like that here. But generally, I don't want the I don't want this area to completely dominate the image. It's going to be a very kind of less is more on this approach. Anyway, so we got our 3D plans, and we can just look at different things here. But if you want to do aquatic and shore, you can see we've got a couple that we can just kind of plop in. So I'm going to download just a few of these. And again, I want to be careful to avoid making it seem like this is the centerpiece. It's not. The actual build and home is still the priority, but we're just building the actual environment. All right, let's see. I'm going to just drag out, let's take a look at these ginger lilies really quickly. Really what I need is probably more weeds and just sort of grasses that I can kind of put in the scene. But now that I've got my variants here, I can easily just left-click on one of these and start placing them. And again, this is kind of a less is more type of thing. I don't necessarily want these to very much dominate the entire scene, but little sprigs here and there should be okay. Okay, so with our grasses and extra grasses added in, we did end up changing the water back to glass and then just adjusting some of the properties of it to give it a nice kind of look. Let's turn on the path tracer. And you can see this is the level of reflections that we're actually getting. And I think the grass is looking nice. Probably needs one more pass. And one thing I did notice was the transition from water into the sort of soggy, wet soil area was probably just a little bit too sharp. So what you can do is, for example, download something like this. Let's grab this tundra rocky ground and just place it into the scene. Now, you'll notice if you were to do this, these don't necessarily match because you've got different material types. So yeah, this does a great job breaking up that water line, but it doesn't look right. So honestly, the easiest thing to do is just to sample whatever material you have been using. In this case, we were kind of using this sort of wet, sandy one, and then you just drag it out. So it would be as simple as going to Materials, Ground, Nature, and say, for example, we wanted a better transition with the grassy ground. You just drag this onto the object that you want, and then it'll work just fine. You can tweak pretty much everything. You're not necessarily, you're using just the geometry more than anything here. It's just a little simple trick. Might not look always perfect because these objects are UV mapped correctly, or at least UV mapped based on the projection, I think. And however, though, it does work pretty nicely if you just need more curved geometry that will actually break up a scene. In other words, right along the edge here. Now, it's a little bit too pronounced. Some of these probably need to come down just a little dash. But what you're avoiding is these really harsh straight lines that you can kind of see. All right, so just even stuff like that, just barely poking out of the surface, will give the impression of a more organic looking transition. You just want to avoid those unnecessarily sharp, hard edges. Okay, I want to set up our camera before we go any further. So click on Image 2, move myself out of the way. And we're going to go over to the camera settings first. First thing I want to do is adjust the actual focal length here. I want to zoom in just a little bit. And I may have to move my camera ever so slightly back. I still want to get those nice weeds. But all in all, by the way, hitting 2 and 1 on the keyboard, 1's a little too slow, but 2 will allow you to fine-tune your actual shot. 24 millimeter, let's put this up to 25. And just move back a little bit. I think that'll work just fine. Pretty happy with that. Now, other things, when we get into lighting, we will adjust the exposure. But for now, I'm pretty happy with the overall look. There's some areas over here on the right that probably need a little TLC. Probably do need to add more grasses and weeds and things like that back there. And some of the patchy grasses I'm okay with. And I think maybe some of these objects that are blending the water, I think I need to add some more rocks and little sprigs of greenery right there. But the camera as a whole, I'm pretty happy with. All right. Next thing we want to do, by the way, I'm going to put the render mode onto, Lumen. You'll notice there's not a massive kind of difference. Shadows are really where you're going to see a huge amount of increased realism. Again, Lumen is a sort of like my understanding, one ray, one bounce approach. But the shadows definitely look magnificent, and so do the actual trees here. I mean, I think the foliage with Lumen on, I mean, those shadows and those highlights are absolutely stunning. And to do this, we are going to make sure that we're using an actual HDRI lighting. I prefer that over the sort of, unlike D5 where you've got the Geo and Sky, and that works pretty well. Like, I still quite like the Geo and Sky. With Twinmotion, I'm not really in love with the natural lighting setup. I do think the HDRIs just look better. Again, personal opinion, there you go. Okay, my idea is to have a pretty strong highlight coming from kind of behind the trees, and I want some pretty extreme shadows. Basically, I want the sun sort of behind this tree here to light up the house, hopefully, and cast some pretty nice shadows. All right, so what we'll do is we'll find a couple of HDRIs and see how they look. After bouncing around and trying a whole pile of different ones, we've settled on Low Sun Cloudy 01, which is a pretty nice HDRI. You'll also notice it's been rotated kind of so we're getting light coming from the direction we want, which is sort of behind the tree in the foreground and coming downwards. So we've rotated it quite a bit. We didn't bother trying to make it a backdrop HDRI because that was going to cut off a lot of the trees and the background. You can kind of see here, we lose a lot, even if you adjust the scale. So we're going to leave it as just a sky dome. And we can tweak the intensity and things like that. But overall, pretty happy with the intensity of about 20. And I think that'll work just fine. This is kind of consistent with what I'm looking for. You can see we've got HDRI effects lighting on, match sun HDRI, and height fog effects. All those are just turned on. Lovely stuff. The actual sun intensity, I was recently schooled on this where you shouldn't put the sun intensity to 0 with Lumen, as it can result in some splotchy shadows. But you can also see if you put the sun intensity to, say default daytime 100,000, you can get some pretty trippy results. So I actually found just putting it at 5. Now, this seems to work just fine for me. This is kind of visually kind of what I'm looking to achieve. As for the actual settings, we are under real-time Lumen. I've cranked the scene detail up, and I've taken the view distance up as high as possible, and I've left the lighting update speed at 1. Now, when it comes time to actually render, I'm going to crank all of these to basically quality all the way up to 10 and bounce count all the way up to 10 as well, just to ensure we get the highest quality for our actual reflections as we can actually get. In this case, I'm going to be dropping the shadow bias down as low as possible and cranking the shadow setting up as high as possible. And overall, I think this is very nice. I like the result I'm actually getting with this. And, pretty good so far. Now, please note, when it comes to doing the path tracer, you can see we are going to have to readjust some of this as well. Now, the other setting is going to actually be under the natural lighting tab, and it is going to be the ambience. You can see by putting the default back to 1, which is the default that it comes at, the overall scene is still just a little too bright. In other words, there's too much ambient light within the actual scene. So I'm going to take this down quite a bit. Obviously, 0 ambient light looks like that, but I do want to make sure that this is a little bit lower. I want darkness in and around the actual grass. Okay. I'm pretty happy with that, so now is a good time to save. And what I'm going to do is actually click on this little guy, and I'm going to attempt to duplicate it. Now, this one on the left is going to be the Lumen, and this one is actually going to be the path tracer. So what I'm going to do is turn on the path tracer and then just refresh. And so you can see I can bounce between my Lumen version and I can go back to my path tracer version. So now what I've got to do is set up the lighting on the path tracer so that it somewhat mimics what we're getting with the Lumen shot. And hopefully, obviously, I think it will be a lot better, the overall result, just because you're not limited to sort of, very low rays and low bounces. To finish our Lumen renders, we just have a few more things to do. I'll move myself to the left again. The first thing is I did crank up the sun intensity just a little bit more. Ambient left at 0.4. And if we go down here, there's a couple of things that I do also want to do. Height fog. By default, this is, I think, at 15. I'm going to increase this quite a bit. Now, I'm watching the horizon line, and generally I found it to be stronger than you'd think. All right, so there, 0.4 or 40%. That'll work fine. All right, next thing. Weather. I do want some wind, especially for the video. So I'm going to take the wind speed up. And you can see if you can crank it all the way to the right to 5. It is quite blustery. This is probably a little bit too much, so let's put this in a nice mild 3. And then the wind direction, I mean, this doesn't really make much difference, honestly, unless you really want the wind to come from a certain direction. But you can just, just play with it. Now, vegetation growth. This I do want to actually do. I'm actually going to increase the age, and you can see as we do that, it does change some of the vegetation substantially, and I want more of these fall colors, so I'm actually going to take this up a little bit more, and I think that looks really nice right about there. Let's put that at 0.5. Okay, last thing I'm going to want to do is add some more foliage, and I want to do it further back here, so let's quit the media mode. And I think what we'll do again is just go down to our painted vegetation. And I'm looking for the trees. There we go. And I'm going to start a whole new line of this painted vegetation. And I think that's going to look pretty nice. Change the diameter a little bit and make it a little bit bigger. And again, just being cognizant of kind of, where the cutoff is for this. So we're seeing, yeah, probably a little too high on those guys. We're kind of seeing, we've lost a lot of the mountains, but overall, I do kind of like the look of this. I think I'm going to keep it. I like having the red trees a little bit closer to us as well. Again, going for that sort of fall autumnal vibe. Now, there's one or two more things I want to do. Camera exposure. We are going to set our exposure manually, not to be confused with the white balance. And we are going to adjust the local exposure as well. So I'm going to bring this guy down. There we go. And when it comes to the highlights, I'm fine with leaving the sky just a little bit more kind of blown out, actually. So let's put that at 0.5. And then the shadows, by default, I think these are at half. So I'm actually going to take these to the left. I want the shadowed areas, the occluded areas, to be darker. Okay, I'm going to add a few more decorative elements inside the house just to make it look like a lived-in. And then we're going to set up our camera, and we're going to do just a couple of renders such as this. Just the camera maybe moving forward, or we'll have the camera maybe just sort of come up with some artistic sort of shots as the camera just kind of pans around under the trees. And remember, you're looking at the foliage is the key here. That's what we're really looking for. And we may end up tweaking the glass just a little bit to make it less reflective. But all in all, I'm pretty happy with the look of this so far. Let's go ahead and set up our path tracer. The path tracer, at the moment I have it set to just medium here, and I've slightly adjusted my settings, so it's about half of what the default is. But overall, very, very similar setup. We click on the ambience tab here, and I change this to on, so go to the environment. You can see sun intensity pretty low. We are still using the same ambient settings, and we've got the same HDRI with slightly different kind of intensity. That's about all. They're pointed the same way, they're just slightly different, and they are the same HDRI. And you can see we're getting pretty much similar results. Now, I do think the shadows in this are still probably a little too bright, but overall, I've got the shadows dimmed as dark as possible. So really the best thing I could possibly do is maybe just reduce the sun intensity, bring that back down, maybe down to 5 here. And so I think the path tracer is just going to give you a obviously better, more realistic result than Lumen, but it's a little bit hard to completely map the exact same settings. Okay, pretty happy with that. Let's go to media. Let's go to video, and I'm going to click plus to create our first video. And you can see right here, it's got the Lumen icon. It's about 10 seconds long, and I'm just going to have the camera move forward on a pretty stable track. Okay, click this little button here to add our next camera shot and hit play. Yeah. That'll work just fine. I am noticing on the back right, I don't have enough grass here, so I'm going to quit the media mode and I'm going to add some more grass there. And these are the type of little things that you might only notice really when you start doing video, or on really kind of on your second playthrough when you're looking at it with fresh eyes. So pretty happy with that one. I think that's going to work just fine. And so that's video one. I'm going to add a second video over here. And the second video you can see as well, I'm going to have to add a lot more grass to get this to work properly. But what we'll do is we'll do a kind of little shot where I'm looking down on the ground. So go over here and hit refresh. I am tilt my camera just up and move it ever so slightly forward. Now, what's really nice about this one is I'm going to select all of these parts of the video here, and we'll actually kind of tweak some of the camera settings here. Okay, so let's go to the settings. I'm going to go to camera. I'll move myself top left corner. And what we're looking for is depth of field. So I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to hit enable. I'm going to pick the focus, which is going to be the grass in shadow for at least this shot right here. Okay, so make sure I hit refresh to update that setting. And then for this shot up here, I'm going to make sure that the house is in focus and again, hit refresh. All right, let's take a look at both of these. A little bit of splotchiness on the shadows there. I think that's just the light coming through the trees. Okay, looks pretty nice. We can keep adding some more Lumen shots as we go. Okay, so let's look at some video clips. So go over here to our video tab, and I've already set up to, let's take a look at video one. This is going to just be our establishing shot, and I'll hit play. And you can see it's a simple sort of pan forward with a slight lift at the end. And total time is about 10 seconds, which I think is sort of long enough for an establishing shot. Now, there are some areas at the back here I don't really love. You can see we're kind of getting, kind of the landscape isn't quite blending. Now, my hope is that this will resolve when we actually render. But if not, you know, most people won't really notice ultimately at the end of the day if their view is focused on the actual home. Now, shot number two, let's pop out here, is slightly more dramatic. I've got a little bit of depth of field going on, and I'm going to end up spinning my camera up towards the home as well. And those two establishing shots can work together. We can probably do another one from this side as well. Maybe just a simple pan, maybe just a lift upwards. And to do this, all we got to do is, again, go to video, click the big start button. And again, I'm just going to maybe just start my camera down here, and I will go and refresh. And I'll actually just move the camera forward like this. I think this does a really good job getting everything we need in the shot. And we can always go back and individually add depth of field or any other effects that we want on a sort of per clip basis. But since we spent a lot of time setting up the lighting, let's just leave it as is. I've added a few more decorative elements into the actual home. We probably will do one or two Lumen-inspired shots from within the home itself. Really just kind of nothing more than just maybe simple, you know, turns to the left or to the right. We've done quite a lot of establishing the actual home and the build itself, so we don't have to spend a huge amount of time inside. So maybe 2 to 3 indoor shots as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and render these out, and I'll see you at the very end. And we'll just take a quick look at doing a little bit of post-production maybe on the path traced renders. All right, see you in a bit. All right, everybody, so this is the path tracer image. We're going to do a pretty quick round of post-production on this one. So we're in Photoshop 2025, right-click on the background layer to duplicate it, click OK. We're going to go up to Filter, and we'll do Camera Raw Filter. And this shouldn't be a surprise if you kind of watched any of my videos at all. Here we are, Camera Raw. So the first thing I'm going to actually do is use a preset just to get kind of our foot in the door a little bit. I've got a list of different favorites here. And the one I'm going to look for is this little red lift matte. And I'm not sure where I got this one, but it's probably available online if memory serves, possibly from one of the sort of preset companies maybe, or you should be able to find it pretty quickly. So Creative Red Lift Matte, I'm going to click on that, and I am going to just drop this down a little bit. I want it to be fall-like, but I don't necessarily want only the reds in the image. Let's go back to Edit. Now, looking at the exposure, things like that, I generally steer clear of the contrast. The exposure is actually pretty good because we set this in Twinmotion. So let's just do a few little tweaks here. I want to make these shadows just a little bit darker. I will take the blacks just a little bit darker as well. Overall, the whites are probably a little bit too high, and really I should drop the highlights as well. The highlights are going to be, you can see the lights in the room. And if I move it to left or right, you can see how bright they get. So I'm going to actually strip these back just a dash, and then just bring up the exposure a little bit just to compensate for that. Okay, color, I'm pretty happy with this. I'm going to take the vibrance up a bit more, and I think that looks pretty nice all in all. Okay, effects. I generally kind of strongly recommend always adding texture and clarity, and then we'll do a slight sharpening as well, just clarity. Dehaze, I don't really, strictly speaking, yes, we want this to be a slightly ethereal kind of feel, kind of a hazy, either early morning kind of vibe, or maybe just as the sun is setting. But I don't really, I'd rather just paint in my lighting, so I think that's okay. Vignettes, if the corners weren't dark, just add a tiny amount of this, and then we're going to add a little bit of grain as well. If we zoom in a little bit here, you can see how strong that grain can get. And I'm just going to add a small amount, just a little bit to kind of make the image look a little bit more photographic. Curve, I'm okay with the overall curves. The preset is doing a lot of the heavy lifting there. And then color mixing, let's zoom in here on the reds. And I do want to dial up the reds just a smidge. I don't want to go like full, almost, AI looking fall shots, but I think that'll look a little bit nice. And I'm going to take up the browns as well. And I'm just looking at that tree in the sort of the right corner there, this guy over here. And again, just take that up a little bit more. Okay, looks pretty nice. Now the blues, we've lost a lot of the blue with the sky, but I'm kind of okay with that. There's enough going on with the actual image itself without kind of ramping up the sky either. So we can put back the color mixer. Detail, I generally do always kind of add a little bit of the sharpening as well. And so I'm not going to like adjust the settings too much. Literally just crank that sharpening. You just really kind of can't really ever have enough of sharpening. And a little bit of lens blur, I'm going to hit apply. And I am going to crank up the blur amount so we can remember what's going on. And you can see it's blurring this bottom section here, which isn't terribly bad, actually. Even without adjusting the slider, kind of moving the blur or moving focus, I'm actually pretty happy with right here is pretty nice. Good job of sort of reading the image and deciding what to keep in focus, which is the building. And then I'm just going to drop the intensity of the blur. Kind of less is more, maybe it is. And I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to make a little bit of chromatic aberration as well, but you can kind of see the difference. The raw looks a little bit desaturated, and I think that is just beautiful. I'm really happy with how this one came out, even though it took kind of a lot longer. Normally a lot of people on YouTube don't point out their mistakes. I had a lot of floating vegetation on this. Weirdly, because of the way they were placed, they didn't latch onto the ground plane like they normally did. And so I ended up having to redo this shot just because there was just too much floating vegetation. And while it looked good within Twinmotion, on a flat image, you actually really did see it. So there you go. Pretty proud of my mistakes there. All right. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.